Hi everybody, welcome to Unit 6. We're going to talk about non-communicable diseases in this unit, and I'm breaking the lecture up into several different parts to make it a little bit easier to digest. So first of all, let's be clear about what non-communicable diseases means. So communicable as a word just means that something is infectious or contagious. It can spread from one person to another. That's called communicability, right? So these are things that are infections. They're due to germs, they're due to bacteria or viruses or parasites or maybe even prions. So these are due to pathogens or germs that can spread from one person to another. So many of the diseases with which public health was primarily focused on until the past half century or so were communicable diseases. So of course, COVID is taking a lot of public health time and attention right now. Influenza does every year. HIV has been enormous and was, when I was your age, for most of those watching, so all the infections that you think about, those are communicable diseases. So non-communicable diseases are basically everything else that isn't an environmental health problem, which is in some ways it's a non-communicable disease if it's environmental. In some ways it's kind of not. We'll get into that in Unit 8. So when we look at causes of death in the whole world, what we'll see is this visualization here. And so I'm going to point out a few things. So everything in blue is a non-communicable disease. What we have over here are the vascular diseases. So heart attacks and strokes are over here. And what we have here is cancer. These are all different types of cancer here. This orange block is infectious diseases. And then this green one is accidents, injuries, and violence. So we can see that globally, the vast majority of deaths that occur are non-communicable diseases, particularly this one over here, which is heart disease, and this one here, which is stroke. Now let's remember, everyone in life is going to die. Right? Life is a fatal illness. It's a terminal condition. So everybody has to die of something. So we're going to have to keep that in mind as we kind of progress through the next couple of slides, right? You have to go somehow, and most older people go with stroke, heart attack, or cancer. All right. If we look at the causes of death by the Social Development Index. So this is a way to kind of measure socioeconomic status of an entire country. So wealthy, highly developed countries versus not wealthy, indigent, or poorly developed countries that don't have a lot of infrastructure and public health services or other systems. So we're going to actually see some significant differences when we compare these two. So in the high social development index countries, we're going to see these non-communicable diseases by far massively outnumber causes of death compared to communicable diseases. The one communicable disease that you see there, that's that big red square, is lower respiratory illness, which is pneumonia, which is what frequently causes death in elderly individuals. If we look at low socio-developmental index countries, we see huge orange squares. So this is communicable or infectious disease. Huge orange squares, major cause of death in those countries. So this difference that we see is remarkable. And what happens over time as a country becomes more developed, more wealthy, is we see a transition from the one pattern of causes of death to the other. So you may hear it mentioned or see the phrase epidemiological transition. That's what they're referring to, that as economic and infrastructure development occurs within a country or a society, we see this change in the major causes of death and disability from a lot of infectious diseases to a lot of non-communicable diseases. As you know, I'm not just interested in what causes deaths. After all, we all need to die at some time, right? Something's got to go. We're never going to decrease the total number of deaths that occur because the total number of deaths that occurs is always going to be equal to the total population eventually over time. So I like the disability adjusted life years. This is a metric that includes two things. One is premature death, so people who die before the average life expectancy for their region, and years lived with disability, or YLDs, which is in the textbook. They talk about that. So it combines those two together, and it's like, well, how much of a problem is this particular condition causing? And again, we can see this huge difference between high social development index and low socioeconomic development index countries in terms of communicable versus non-communicable diseases. If we look specifically at the United States, we're not very different from any of the other high SDI countries, but I just want to point out that if we're not looking at death, we're looking at things that shorten people's lives or make their lives less healthy. It looks pretty different. So we're still going to see heart disease and stroke up here. This is heart disease and stroke. We're still going to see the cancers. These are the cancers here. So those are still really large causes of disability, of poor health in our country. But we also start to see a lot of other categories emerge as well. Here are the musculoskeletal conditions. Look how big back pain is, and our neck pain and osteoarthritis, right? Those can really impair people's health and well-being. Down here we see mental health, right? Very sizable contribution to disability adjusted life years. Not a large cause of death, although there is mortality associated with many mental illnesses, but a huge cause of disability. And we see some of the chronic diseases, so diabetes and chronic kidney disease are here. Lung diseases, so COPD, which is caused by smoking, and asthma are here. And then some neurologic things, everything from headaches to Alzheimer's disease are down here. We do have some infections, right? They're over here. And then we do have a sizable number of accidents, injuries, and violence that contribute to disability as well. So that's the picture in the United States for disability adjusted life years. But we can see that heart disease and stroke and cancer are still really big causes of not just death, but of also impaired health or premature death. Okay. So atherosclerosis is the cause behind heart attacks and strokes, and then cancer. So those are kind of the big two. So I'm going to focus in on those a little bit. The text doesn't really explain to you what those are, and I think it's really important. So here we go. These big two. So vascular disease, problems with your blood vessels, or atherosclerosis, is the cause behind heart attacks, which is also referred to as ischemic heart disease. So if you see IHD, that's what they're talking about. And then heart attacks lead to heart failure. Atherosclerosis or vascular disease also is what causes strokes and is a primary cause of a lot of the kidney disease that we see. In terms of cancer, the big ones, the most common ones and the most common causes of death and disability in the United States are going to be lung cancer, colon cancer, and breast and prostate cancer. So those are going to be the big ones. So if we dial in a little bit and talk about atherosclerosis. So if you've ever heard of hardening of the arteries, that's what atherosclerosis is. So what happens is inside your arteries, you build up this gunk, right? You can kind of see that yellowish stuff there that narrows the inside of your arteries, right? It's clogging up your plumbing. Over time, this will get kind of stiff and hard, and that's where the sclerosis part of the word comes into play. But we call this plaque, this build-up gunk on the inside of your arteries. And what happens is that because the pipes aren't wide open, so to speak, you can't get good blood flow through those. And sometimes the gunk can build up to such a point that the artery gets completely blocked off altogether. Obviously, if the parts of your body aren't getting the blood flow that they need to deliver oxygen and glucose and the other things that cells need to survive, then those cells aren't going to function well, and eventually, if it's severe enough, those cells will die and stop functioning entirely. So for example, if you have a blockage in one of the arteries to your heart muscle, which is called a coronary artery, that's what causes a heart attack. And a heart attack is a death of some of those heart muscle cells due to lack of blood supply. Similarly, a stroke is due to the same problem happening in the brain. So a blockage of blood flow to a part of the brain, those brain cells die and therefore can't function anymore. That's what causes a stroke. So atherosclerosis, when it occurs, happens in all parts of the body, but there are certain places where it manifests in things that we can see and diagnose and treat more easily than others. But the big ones that cause problems, of course, are heart attacks and strokes. So from a public health standpoint, then, we want to know what are the contributory causes, right? What are the risk factors that are associated with this process of atherosclerosis, of blockages in the arteries, gunk in the arteries? And we're going to break them into two main categories: modifiable, things that you can modify or change, and non-modifiable, meaning you're just stuck with it, you can't change it. So I'm going to start with non-modifiable first, right? So age. The older you get, the more likely you are to have gunk in your arteries. It's just a side effect of living a long life. So the older you are, the higher your risk. Biologic sex. Interestingly, if you're male-bodied, you have a higher risk of atherosclerosis than female-bodied people, which is one of the reasons why female-bodied people have a longer life expectancy than male-bodied people. Genetics or family history are also important. Is there something that runs in your family that's part of your genes that predisposes you to be more likely to get atherosclerosis? And then I've put the social determinants of health here in parentheses, because although you might say, well, technically they're potentially modifiable, hopefully now, having seen some of the videos and the documentaries, you realize that people only have often just a small amount of control over some of those social determinants of health. So maybe they should go kind of in between modifiable and non-modifiable, because certainly with some societal changes, we could improve them, but at the individual level, they are difficult to change. In terms of modifiable, then, the major risk factors for atherosclerosis or blockages in your arteries are tobacco use and smoking. It's huge, huge. Having high blood pressure that you don't control because it causes increased strain on the insides of those arteries. High blood cholesterol, also called hyperlipidemia, because then that cholesterol contributes to the gunk. And having diabetes. Diabetes is a condition where you have elevated blood sugars, and those elevated blood sugars are going to encourage that gunk to form on the inside of the arteries. So those are the risk factors that we're going to think about on the public health side to say, what things could we perhaps develop some interventions to decrease the burden of this disease? Okay. Oh, I forgot. There are contributory causes to those modifiable causes, right? So poor diet, lack of exercise, obesity, and stress, right? All of those things are going to contribute to your likelihood of having high blood pressure, high blood cholesterol, and diabetes, right? So there's causes of causes of causes of things, right? It all builds up. Okay, so that's atherosclerosis, which causes heart attacks and strokes. What's cancer? So cancer is really common. You hear about it all the time, as you should, because it's really common and it's really significant. But it's important to me, anyway, that you understand what cancer is. So cancer happens when one of your body's cells, anywhere in your body, gets a genetic mutation. So something happens to the genes inside that cell. Either it's damaged by some UV radiation, or you are exposed to some type of toxin or chemical, or just bad luck. So a lot of mutations just spontaneously occur, and it can be just your bad luck that the type of mutation that occurs in one of your cells is one that makes it cancerous. So that genetic mutation, that change in a gene, ends up making that cell go crazy. So it goes rogue. It starts not behaving like a normal cell is supposed to, usually in three main ways. One is that it starts multiplying rapidly and making copies of itself. It's like a rabbit, right? It just starts making more and more and more and more cells. So it starts growing uncontrollably. Normally, we have a lot of systems in place to make sure that our cells only multiply and make copies of themselves at a certain rate. And that rate is usually just enough to replace the cells that are dying, which is a continual process in our bodies. But a cancer cell starts going crazy and making lots and lots and lots of copies of itself. It also often won't die. So as I mentioned, all of our cells normally have a lifespan. Some of our longest lived cells are in our bones, and they live for 7 years before dying and being replaced, right, by multiplication of another cell to replace that dying cell. Cancer cells don't die. They're tough. The other thing that they do, and this is what really gets us into a lot of trouble, is that they start invading and spreading to other areas. So all of our cells, interestingly enough, kind of know where they're supposed to be and where they belong. For example, cells in my eyeball don't start migrating and moving around to my nose, right? They stay in my eyeball. They know where they're supposed to be. But cancer cells start invading and spreading out. And so that's what you're seeing in the diagram below, is that these cells start multiplying and making more copies of themselves, and then they start branching out and moving out into other parts of the body. And that's when they're really going to cause some trouble for us. So what does it mean when somebody has breast cancer versus colon cancer versus prostate cancer or lung cancer? So these different types are named for the organ in which that cancer first started. So where did that cell that got the mutation that made it go rogue, what kind of cell was it and what part of the body did it live in? So if it was a breast cell that starts becoming cancerous due to mutation, then I have breast cancer. If it's a brain cell, now I have brain cancer. So it depends on where it all started. And it's important to acknowledge that, especially among some cancer types, breast cancer is a good example, is that there can be multiple subtypes. So just as there are lots of different types of cells that live in the breast, and there's lots of different types of mutations that can cause a cell to become cancerous, depending on that combination, you can have many different subtypes of breast cancer. So it's important to acknowledge that although there will be some general rules that are true for most breast cancers, some are going to be very different from others. Same thing with lung cancers, same thing with brain cancers. There's different subtypes within those general types. So I mentioned that cancer cells can invade and spread. So that's called metastasis. And so when that occurs and cancer starts spreading and causing tumors to grow in different parts of your body, that's called a metastatic cancer or a stage 4 cancer. This is what is often fatal because it's invading those other organs, and then those other organs can't do their jobs, and we need all of our organs to keep us alive. They also, because they're multiplying so rapidly, start consuming all of our body's resources and starving the other normal cells. So those are the ways that cancer ends up causing disability often and death. It's by spreading throughout the body, invading other organs, and really monopolizing and stealing resources from our other cells, starving them out. So what are the risk factors for cancer? So we're going to talk about a couple of different categories. First, there are the non-modifiable. You can't help these, they just are what they are. So age, for most but not all cancers, the longer you live, the higher your risk. That's why cancer, for the most part, most commonly happens in older people. Our cells have made copies of themselves more often, therefore they've had more opportunities to make mistakes and incur a mutation. So the longer you live, in general, the higher your risk of cancer. Genetics or family history. Sometimes you're born with a little bit of a mutation that already gets your cell partway towards being cancerous, right? So you can inherit that risk factor from your family. Exposures to certain carcinogens. So the word carcinogen, gen as in genesis, means giving rise to. Carcin is like carcinoma, which is a name for a type of cancer. So these are cancer-causing things like certain chemicals or radiation. You may or may not have control over that. It might be something you're exposed to at work, something you're exposed to at home or in your community. It can vary a lot. Race and ethnicity is important. For some cancers, it increases your risk. Some cancers, it decreases your risk. It's not always consistent. It's pretty interesting. And then your biologic sex, I put it in there. Within different cancer types, it doesn't really matter except for the ones that you can't get because you don't have that body part. I can never get testicular cancer. I don't have testicles, right? So those types of things. So that's why I kind of put it in parentheses because it's like, well, yeah, of course. Then there are modifiable risk factors. And so these are things that you have some control or agency over. So tobacco smoking, not just for lung cancer, it increases your risk of every cancer, right? And it also increases your risk for atherosclerosis, as we saw before. Having excess body weight increases your risk of most cancers, interestingly. Alcohol consumption also increases your risk, which is really interesting because how often have you heard about how, oh, a glass of wine with dinner can decrease your risk of heart disease? Which is true, but interestingly, they don't tell you a glass of wine with dinner can increase your risk of cancer, which is also true, right? So they can't really sell you alcohol by telling you it's going to increase your risk of cancer, right? So, ultraviolet radiation, that one's pretty unique to skin cancer for the most part. Poor diet, there are a lot of cancers where risk is associated with an unhealthy diet. You can see infections here. So there are certain viruses and other germs that can actually increase your risk of certain types of cancers, which is fascinating. And then physical inactivity. So you notice excess body weight, unhealthy diet, and physical inactivity all are independent risk factors. So many of us know people that might be a normal body weight and they might exercise regularly, but they eat McDonald's all the time. Those people are still at increased risk of cancer, okay? So these are all things that are general and apply to pretty much all of the cancers, but then of course we're going to have some cancer specific risk factors. So for example, if you've never had a pregnancy and given birth, you are at increased risk of breast cancer. There are certain factors that increase your risk for prostate cancer. Obviously, smoking increases your risk for lung cancer, even above the general increased risk of cancer. So there are different things that are specific to different types of cancer. We're not going to have time to go into those, but maybe if that's what you choose to do your report on, you'll have the opportunity to do so then. So our two big non-communicable diseases are atherosclerosis, so vascular disease, blockages in your arteries, which causes heart attacks and strokes, and then on the other hand, cancers, of which there are various types. So there are other non-communicable diseases. Obviously, we looked at some of those, but these are things that are not communicable, not infections, not contagious. So what are the tools that public health is going to use to kind of approach these conditions and hopefully alleviate the burden of disease? And so I like to think of that as the toolkit for non-communicable diseases, or NCDs. This is what's in the toolkit. So screening programs, risk factor interventions, identifying which treatments are cost effective, making sure we prevent or avoid or ameliorate somehow any potential long-term harms that could accrue over time from our treatments. Genetics in medicine is pretty interesting. So there's some testing, some counseling, and even some interventions that are now available. So we're going to want to think about that. And then research. So public health as a discipline contributes a lot to research to help us understand what screening programs work best, what risk factors are there, what interventions are going to be effective, how good are treatments, all these things, as well as helping us to develop new treatments and potential therapeutics in the future. So that's the end of part 1, and then we're going to pick up in part 2 by starting talking about screening. All right, thanks everybody.